Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining on this fall crisp morning. We are really thankful that you all have chosen to take time out of your mornings to hear more about Minnesota paid leave. We are going to jump in and get started as there's a lot of content to cover. I'd love to just start off with a couple of brief introductions. So my name is Jenna Eslick, and I am the president of HR Solutions at Versique Executive Professional and Interim Consulting, Recruiting, excuse me. And Versique, just a high-level overview, we are a local Minnesota-based recruiting firm that helps companies find talent through our three service offerings: executive, professional, and interim. My team specifically is focused on all things HR, from executive, professional, and interim. And we just wanted to remind this audience that we are here as your partners as you navigate and prepare for Minnesota paid leave, preparing for the administration, and post go live date in January. As you think about workforce planning, we are here as a resource. We have talented consultants and professionals that are extremely knowledgeable in this space and would love to connect with you and talk further about how we can be a partner. With that, here's an intro of our total HR Solutions team. And I will pass the baton over to Sarah Dahl with MMA to share an introduction of herself. And then we'll just talk about a few housekeeping items before we jump into the content. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Sarah Dahl. I'm the Ancillary Benefits Consultant at Marsh McLennan Agency. I have been at MMA for over 14 years, but I like to say that I've been doing insurance type work since the 1900s. I'm very pleased to chat with you today. As Jenna said, we do have a lot to cover. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jenna and we will go over the housekeeping items.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. So we encourage throughout this presentation that Sarah will be leading for you to utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions as we're going throughout the content within the presentation. And we will do our best to gather those question themes and ask those throughout the presentation. So please don't feel like you have to wait until the end of the presentation to ask questions. There's a lot of detailed information, and we want to make sure that as we're going through the content, you have an opportunity to ask those specific questions. We will also have some time at the end for additional questions and answers. Our goal is to spend about 40-ish minutes on the content and then save the remaining time at the end for questions. The other thing I would mention is that this is being recorded, and Sarah has graciously offered to share some follow-up slides with all of you following today's webinar. So with that, we will go ahead and jump right in. Over to you, Sarah.
All right. Thank you, Jenna. Before we get started, my attorneys make me say that I am not an attorney. MMA is not your attorney. Versique is not your attorney. For those of you that have been following along with paid leave over the last couple of years, you know that it's incredibly complex. It will continue to evolve, not only the program itself, but as I like to say, we're in just this period of learning right now. So as we become more familiar with paid leave, not only will the program evolve down the road, but just, our basic understanding of how things work is in a constant state of flux right now. Certainly your organization is subject to other paid or unpaid time off programs or leave requirements that we may touch on tangentially a little bit today, but some of them we will not address at all. So please don't take this to be a comprehensive overview of all leave types. We really are focusing on just Minnesota paid leave. And with that, I must remind you to consult with your employment law counsel as needed. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to start off with the basics. We're going to review the when, the who, the what, the how. We're going to talk about public versus private coverage. That's a lot of the questions I'm getting from employers right now is, how do I choose? What's the difference? What does it mean to be public or private? Going into those considerations, there are more things to think about than you might think of just on the surface. We'll talk through those. Really focus in on the private plan process steps. As you can imagine, this is a multi-step process. And paying attention to that multi-step process, how do you work that into some key deadlines, some really key deadlines that I want you to pay attention to? At the very end of our deck, there are some other employer preparation tasks. And then throughout, we will leave some space for Q&A during the presentation and of course at the end. So let's get going right away here. Honestly, this is the simplest concept that I have for you this entire presentation, which is the when. When does it begin? January 1st, 2026. Both contributions and benefit entitlement begin. For those of you that are multi-state employers who have experience with, say, Oregon, Colorado, Massachusetts, Connecticut, etc., you know that those states had a period of pre-funding where employees had to pay into the program and employers had to pay into the program before benefits could be payable. But not us in Minnesota. We're cool, right? So we are starting both contributions and benefit entitlement right on January 1st, 2026. Who is covered? I would say this right here is probably where I've spent the majority of my time talking to employers over the last 2 years about who is covered. All public and private employers with one or more employees in covered employment are included in Minnesota paid leave. A relatively short list of excluded employers, but what I want to point out here is what you don't see. You don't see, say, employers with 50 or more employees in a 75-mile radius, right? You don't see that like FMLA. You don't see employees with 15 or more, right? Which might be related to 80 AAA coverage. You don't see employees who work 30 hours a week, right? You don't see that. You don't see employees are covered, but only first of the month following 30 days of service. You don't see that. What you do see is employees, one or more employees in covered employment are covered by Minnesota paid leave. Short list, like I said, of who's excluded. Federal government, tribal nations are excluded. We'll get into the employees that are excluded here in just a second. So what exactly does covered employment mean? There are two ways for an employee to be in covered employment. The first one is the simplest. If I am your employee and I'm working in the state of Minnesota 50% or more of the time, I am in covered employment. If I only work for you 1 day a week, right? But that 1 day a week that I work, I am working in the state of Minnesota, I am in covered employment. If I meet this criteria where I'm working in the state of Minnesota at least half the time, it doesn't matter where I live. As you can imagine, I'm talking to a lot of employers in, say, like the Duluth Superior area or the Fargo Moorhead area, in the Twin Cities, Woodbury, Hudson area, right? So you could have an employee who lives in Minnesota, but if they work in Fargo, North Dakota, at least half the time, even though they're Minnesota residents, they are actually not covered by Minnesota paid leave, right? Flip-flop that. If I live in Superior, Wisconsin, but I work in Minnesota, I am covered by Minnesota paid leave. So when you reach that 50% threshold of working in the state of Minnesota, I don't care where you live. I don't care where your company is headquartered. I've been getting this question a lot lately. Well, Sarah, what if I work in Minnesota, but my entire team that I'm supporting is in Iowa, right? That's out of the state, and they all work in Iowa. I don't care. Where are you, the individual employee, working? If you're working in Minnesota at least 50% of the time, then you're covered. On the other side of that coin, if you are working in a state other than Minnesota at least 50% or more of the time, you are not covered by Minnesota paid leave. And again, I don't care where you live. I live in Blaine, right? If I live in Blaine, but I drive all the way to Hudson, Wisconsin for work every day, I'm working in Wisconsin 100% of the time. Am I covered by Minnesota paid leave even though I live in Minnesota? I am not. Okay, so that first criteria, that's the simplest one. Now, not every employee works necessarily in one single state all of the time. And some of our employees, right, they don't work half the time in any single state. So that's criteria two. If I do not work 50% or more in any single state, but some work is done in Minnesota and I live in Minnesota, then I'm covered by Minnesota paid leave. That's a little confusing, so let me give you an example. Say that I work in Iowa 33% of the time, and maybe South Dakota 34% of the time, and then Minnesota the other 33% of the time. I've not hit that 50% threshold in any single state, right? But some work is done in Minnesota. And if I live in Minnesota, that's the point at which I care where you live, then you are covered by Minnesota paid leave. Okay, so there are two ways to qualify. The short answer here is Minnesota paid leave localization and Minnesota unemployment localization are very, very, very similar. They are virtually identical. Not exactly identical, but virtually identical. So if you are doing your Minnesota unemployment correctly, that's a good way to follow, where does my employee fit as far as Minnesota paid leave eligible or not. The caveat to that is that there are some employees and some entities that are not subject to unemployment who are subject to Minnesota paid leave. But majority of Minnesota workers are subject to Minnesota unemployment. So a general guideline there is to follow what you're doing for unemployment. So going back to who's not covered, like I said, it's a real short list, friends. Federal government, tribal nations, right? Not covered. As far as employees, independent contractors, the self-employed, railroad employees, and certain seasonal employees are not covered. Now, before you get excited about seasonal employees being excluded, please be aware that seasonal applies to a very incredibly narrow group of employees. The employee has to be in hospitality as defined by statute. The employee has to be employed fewer than 150 days in a 52 consecutive week period. And the employer also has to show seasonality in their business receipts. So kind of to digest that for a second, what you don't see here, retail seasonal, covered by Minnesota paid leave. Perhaps agricultural seasonal, covered by Minnesota paid leave. In my insurance days back in the 1900s, I felt like a broken record telling employers, stop putting your interns on your life insurance, on your dental insurance. They're not covered. Guess what? Your interns, if they are W-2 employees in covered employment, are covered by Minnesota paid leave. Talking to some colleges and universities around the state, guess what? Your student workers who are not otherwise covered by, say, your medical or dental, they are covered by Minnesota paid leave. The other icons that you're seeing here, either the red X or the green check mark, those indicate who is not covered but may opt in, or not covered but may not opt in. Those independent contractors and self-employed tribal nations, if you want to opt in, you simply go out to the Minnesota paid leave / unemployment account and you opt in that way. Okay, I know there are always questions when it comes to localization. Jenna, do we have any coming in that we want to address?
We sure do. So on that topic, Sarah, one of the question is around remote worker criteria. So the specific question is the work location for the worker is in Minnesota, but the business is in Iowa.
Great, fantastic. If your employee is working, they're physically doing their job in the state of Minnesota, even though it is for a company in Iowa, they are covered by Minnesota paid leave.
Okay, great, thank you. The other question is, so this particular company is looking at going the private direction. and a portion of their workforce is transitory and moves every 3 months between companies, will that cause any issues for those employees getting paid after they're no longer employed by this particular company?
So if that other company that your employee is going to is not you, right? Because I say that because, at MMA we have a lot of clients that maybe have a holding company and then they have different subsets of businesses with separate tax IDs under this holding company. But if I'm the employee and I come work for you for 3 months and then whatever happens, I go to a different employer, that doesn't really matter. And it doesn't really matter public or private. Their changing jobs doesn't necessarily impact their eligibility for Minnesota paid leave, other than depending on how much work they're doing out of state, right? We're going to talk in here a second about the wage credits that an employee would need to have in order to be eligible to file a claim. But changing jobs, being a job hopper, that fact in and of itself does not necessarily mean that they would not be eligible for paid leave.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. The next one is less on kind of the location, and it's specific to nonprofits. So we have someone that is part of a nonprofit organization and heard that paid medical leave has not been finalized for nonprofits because they're still trying to figure out how to get the money from nonprofit organizations for the funding. Do you have information on nonprofit organizations and PFMLA?
Yeah, there is no exemption for nonprofit organizations under Minnesota paid leave. So if you are a nonprofit organization with employees in covered employment, you are subject to Minnesota paid leave. A question that I get every so often is around religious employers, right? Religious employers not subject to unemployment, but are subject to Minnesota paid leave. So there's no exemption for nonprofits. There is no exemption for religious employers.
Okay, very helpful. The other question, Sarah, is around independent contractors and if they are covered.
So independent contractors, if they are not your W-2 employee, they are not your problem from an employer perspective. When it comes to Minnesota paid leave, I should caveat that, right? If I'm an independent contractor for MMA, right, I'm a 1099, perhaps I'm a non-W-2 employee. MMA, my employer has no obligation to me under Minnesota paid leave. However, if I'm an independent contractor, I could opt in to Minnesota paid leave on my own. But the entity for whom I am working, they do not cover me under Minnesota paid leave. No.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Sarah.
All right, let's move on. What are the benefit eligibility requirements? So in order for me, pretend, right, that I am your star employee and I need to file for Minnesota paid leave. In order for me to file a claim and be eligible, I have to have enough wage credits. The employee has to have earned at least 5.3% of the state's average annual wage in the base period. Okay, there's a lot of key terms to pay attention to in this block. 5.3% of the state's average annual wage, using the October 1st, 2025 state average weekly wage, that's about $3,900. So the base period, that's defined under statute as the 4 completed calendar quarters prior to my leave. So very loosely, think about it in terms of, has your employee earned at least $3,900 in the year before their leave? Now, the key thing to remember here is the employee does not have to have earned that approximately $3,900 from you as their current employer. That 5.3% of wage credits, that's aggregated across all Minnesota employment. In Minnesota, we have been doing wage reporting for Minnesota paid leave since October of 2024, right? It started for Q3 2024. Part of the reason why they started that early was to give employers enough time to, do all of the right steps to get that set up and get employers used to doing that wage reporting, and for the state to set a baseline of information so that when employees start filing claims right away in January, then they can tell, did Sarah have enough wage credits to even be eligible for benefits? So a couple other key things here. Key concept is benefit eligibility and being in covered employment are not the same thing. And that's I'm seeing some confusion in the marketplace where in some cases that 5.3% wage credit is being presented as, well, you don't even have to pay in to paid leave until you reach that criteria. And that's simply not accurate. I have to have earned 5.3% or about $3,900 in the last year to be eligible for paid leave. So an example of that might look like you hire me, it's January 15th, 2026. It's my very first day to show up at work, right? Halfway through my day, I get appendicitis and I obviously can't stay at work. I'm going to be gone for a few weeks, likely. I've only worked for you for half a day. I clearly haven't earned $3,900 from you, my brand new employer, in half a day. But as long as I have earned 5.3% of the state's average annual wage in the last year from all Minnesota employment, then I am eligible to take a leave. I haven't even worked for you for one day. Okay? How does an employer provide compliant Minnesota paid leave coverage? There's two options. You must pick one. Applicable employers must either participate in the state plan, or the public plan, or private insurance, either the state or private insurance. The private insurance may be fully insured. Most employers who are choosing private insurance are choosing fully insured, or it can be self-funded. Out of the probably hundreds of clients that I've talked to in the last 9 months, I only know of one who's really serious about going self-funded. Vast majority are going fully insured, at least initially, for private insurance for Minnesota paid leave. So I'm really going to spend most of my time, the rest of the time we have together here, talking about private insurance in terms of fully insured coverage. So what does Minnesota paid leave provide? Well, it provides a lot, actually. It provides up to 12 weeks of medical leave per benefit year for covered employees, up to 12 weeks of family leave per benefit year. Family leave includes time away from work for bonding with your newly acquired dependent, safety leave, which is time away from work to deal with situations related to sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, things of that nature. Family care includes care for a family member's serious health condition and dealing with military exigency. So those 4 items all fall under the family leave bucket. So I really want you to think about the medical leave and the family leave in terms of 2 separate entitlement allotments. 12 weeks medical, 12 weeks family, right? 12 plus 12 is 24, but not in Minnesota, right? In Minnesota, you cannot take more than 20 total weeks of leave per benefit year. So what that might look like is, say in the beginning of 2026, it's winter in Minnesota, I slip and fall on the ice and mess up my knee, I need knee surgery. I might take 8 weeks of knee surgery, right? Beginning of January 2026. Later in the summer, I'm water skiing and oh, dang it, I fall on the water skis, mess up the same knee again. Well, if I took 6 weeks at the beginning of the year, now I only have 6 of my 12 weeks left to use for medical leave. Okay, so think of it, once you burn down your balance in your medical leave bucket, that balance of time is gone. You cannot borrow or transfer unused time from the medical bucket to the family leave bucket or vice versa. When it's gone in that benefit year. Also, for Minnesota paid leave, group insurance must be continued, and the employee and the employer must pay their share of premiums. And this is notable for a couple of different reasons. For those of you that are used to dealing with federal FMLA, you know that group health insurance must be continued while on federal FMLA. Minnesota paid leave statute is written very specifically in that it says all group insurance must be continued. So be prepared for that. Also, right, I just said that employees could take perhaps up to 20 total weeks of leave per year. If I'm having a baby, guess how much time I'm going to be gone from work? I'm probably going to be gone for 20 weeks, right? I could take up to 12 weeks of medical and then bump that right up against with my bonding leave and take, if I've used 12 weeks of medical, then I've got 8 weeks of bonding leave. So I want employers to think about, how are you going to collect the employee share of premiums while they are on leave? There's a few ways you can consider doing that. When the need for leave is foreseeable, especially with maternity, you may have enough time to set up a prepayment plan with your employee. You could have me write you a check while I am out on leave every month. That's another way to do it. Or you could have me pay it back when I return. So any of those are available options. You'll have to work with your accounts payable department and figure out what the best way to do that for your organization is. Job protection. Minnesota paid leave also provides job protection 90 days after date of hire, right? That's the one place here in the Minnesota paid leave where I see kind of like a waiting period, so to speak. So job protection begins 90 days after date of hire. So in that scenario where I show up to work and I get appendicitis on the first day and have to take a leave, you're not obligated to hold my job. But before you run out and fire everyone that's taking a Minnesota paid leave who hasn't hit that 90-day mark, proceed with caution. Please consult the appropriate experts in this area, because there are interference and retaliation clauses written within the law. Now, I've said benefit year a couple of times here, right? So what exactly is the benefit year? For those of you who end up in the state plan or the public plan, the benefit year is 12 months rolling forward. So 12 months rolling forward from the first date of leave is the benefit year. For those of you that are subject to federal FMLA, blow the dust off of that policy and check out what your calendaring method is there. Because for many of you, it's probably 12 months rolling backwards. It is perfectly okay to have different calendar methods, one for FMLA and one for Minnesota paid leave. That is fine. You are under no obligation to change your federal FMLA policy. Just understand that if you're in the state plan and the public plan, the calendar method is going to look forward. For those of you that end up with private coverage, you are allowed to choose your calendar method. So you could choose rolling backward, you could choose calendar year, or whatever the case may be. But be aware that there's some carrier variance out there. Not every carrier can accommodate that. So if that's your desire to have something other than looking forward, and you have private insurance, ask some specific questions of your carrier to make sure that they can do that. And then real quickly, a word about bonding. Bonding leave, right? That's in that family care bucket. Bonding leave rules allow employees to use their bonding leave up to 1 year from the acquisition date of their child. And I choose the word acquisition very deliberately because bonding is applicable to birth, adoption, or foster. So that simply means then that your employees who are acquiring dependents in 2025 are eligible for up to 12 weeks of family leave, of bonding leave in 2026, even if they are perhaps not yet eligible for FMLA in 2026, or maybe they still don't have FMLA time available to them, right? Your eligibility or ineligibility for federal FMLA and Minnesota paid leave really has no bearing on the eligibility or ineligibility for the other. All right. That was a lot. I know there's a ton of questions. After I talk about that, what do we have, Jenna?
All right. We do have a number of questions. So the first question is around family member. So when we're talking about family members, how is a family member defined?
Love that question. So for those of you that are familiar with federal FMLA, the list of family members is deliciously short, right? Spouse, child, parent. Under Minnesota paid leave, the definition of family member looks very similar to the definition of family member under ESST. They are not identical, and I think the reason for that is because ESST and paid leave are governed by two different state agencies. But Minnesota paid leave's family member includes a laundry list of of individuals, grandparents, siblings, parent-in-laws, etc. So it's a long list.
Okay, great. We have a couple of questions that are similar to the one that I'm going to ask. So if an employee has family leave at the end of a plan year, for example, in December, would they be able to take 4 weeks in one plan year and then 12 weeks under the new plan year for the same occurrence?
So I think if they're talking about only about Minnesota paid leave,
Mm-hmm.
remember it's going to depend on what the calendaring method is, right? If you're in the state plan, it's rolling forward. So if I if I've used, right, it depends on how much leave you've used. So if I've used all 12 weeks of my leave, right, I don't gain back that 12 weeks of time until the following year, beginning in the date that my leave began. If it's rolling backward, it's going to be different. I think where most of the time where that question comes from is because employers are trying to balance like, well, Sarah already used her FMLA. So let me give you an example. I have a baby early October 2025, right? My employer rolls backwards for FMLA. Okay, so if I have my baby in early October 2025, 12 weeks of FMLA pushes me right up against 12/31/2025, right? So when 1/1/2026 rolls around, because my employer is rolling backwards on federal FMLA, I don't have any federal FMLA time left on 1/1/2026. But guess what I do have? Minnesota paid leave because it is a brand new leave entitlement. And I have up to 12 weeks of leave for bonding time, and I have up to a year from the acquisition date of my child to use it. So I hope that answers the questions because I generally do get that type of question in relation to, well, my employee already exhausted their FMLA. You're telling me they get more time under Minnesota paid leave? Very possibly, yes.
Mm-hmm.
When Minnesota paid leave and FMLA can hold hands, they should. And by that, I mean when they can run together, you should decrement both leave banks. But there will be several times when an employee might be eligible for Minnesota paid leave and not eligible for FMLA. So in that case, you cannot run them concurrently.
Okay.
All right,
Great.
let's keep going here. What is the Minnesota paid leave benefit payment? The short answer is it's complicated. The longer answer is that it's a three-tier calculation based on the employee's earnings relative to the state average weekly wage, or the SAWW. It starts off at 90%, grades down to 55%, and the maximum benefit is generally what the current state average weekly wage is. So for most of 2026, the maximum benefit will be $1,423. So what is this actually? I mean, this type of formula, I always joke that it looks like if a train leaves the Duluth train station at noon, what time does it meet the train from Milwaukee? Which, right, kind of makes me itch. So let's look at what this, how this plays out with some real life examples. If you've got a $50,000 worker, an employee who earns $50,000, and you calculate their weekly wage and run that weekly wage through this three-tier calculation, that $50,000 worker is going to end up with a Minnesota paid leave award of about $805 or about 84% income replacement. So contrast that with an employee who earns a little bit more, say $150,000. That $150,000 wage earner is going to cap out at the maximum, right? They're going to cap out at 1423 in 2026. So this $150,000 worker is only bringing home 49% replacement. So you'll see that this is designed to put proportionately higher wage replacement in the wallets of our lower paid workers. Okay. How much is this going to cost? Well, we know that the public plan, the state plan, the cost is 0.88% up to the FICA cap, right? Every employer who participates in the public plan, that is their rate. Private insurance, those of you that choose to look to a private insurance company, the rate is going to vary by employer because the insurance company is going to underwrite you. For those of you that are, tossing around the idea of being self-funded, you'll have the cost of claims. And specifically for Minnesota paid leave self-funded plans, you also need to get a surety bond. What questions do we have, Jenna?
Yes. So we do have a few questions following up on family members, and is there an age limit on family members?
For example, I'm guessing that this is related to, is there an age limit on child? No,
Yeah.
there isn't. No, there is not. No, which is different from federal FMLA, right? Generally speaking, no. My 81-year-old mother, if she were still working, she could take a leave to care for her almost 50-year-old daughter. Yes, that would be allowed.
Okay. We have a few questions around requirements for informing employees about the policy.
Yeah,
Is there anything formal like that
yeah.
needs to be signed, or is, say,
Yep.
a training sufficient?
Yeah. So when the need for leave is foreseeable, the employee should be giving the employer at least 30 days notice. That is right in the statute. For those of you that are end up in the public plan, I have seen a screenshot of what the employee portal looks like when the employee goes to file a claim. And it asks, about when did you tell your employer, right? Because they are also looking for that 30-day notification when the need for leave is foreseeable. So keep that in mind. When it comes to who is making decisions on leave eligibility, is it approved? Do you have enough time? That is going to be all administrated depending on who your leave provider is, your Minnesota paid leave provider is. If it's with the state is going to handle that. If you have private insurance, the insurance company is going to handle that. So there will be forms, there will be required documentation depending on the leave type requested, and that documentation will go either to the state or to the insurance company.
Okay. All right. Sarah, one more question. This one, there's a couple on this topic actually. So the question is, we're opting for a private, fully insured plan and expect to share the premium with the employee. The employee's cost cannot exceed what it would be under the public plan. Does that mean their cost cannot exceed 0.44% of their wages, or just that it cannot exceed half of the total premium? We expect the total premium will be more than 0.88% of wages.
Yep. So that's a great leading question because it's right here on my slide. It's like we planned.
It's like we planned.
So I'm going to answer that in context of my slide. Okay. So this is simple side-by-side, high-level bullet points of how things are going to work under the public plan and how things are going to work under private plans, right? Under the public plan, again, we know the rate is 0.88% up to the FICA cap, and the employer pays at least half if you are more than 31 employees in the state of Minnesota. Okay, you have to pay at least half. You could pay more. Employers could pay anywhere from 50 to 100%. I will tell you that at least in my conversations with clients at MMA, a sweeping majority are planning on sharing that cost 50-50. A very scant handful are even considering paying more than half. So don't feel like you're going to be alone if you have your employee share in that cost. On the private side, your rate might be higher than 0.88, it might be lower. When your private plan rate is higher, let's say it's 0.96, right? When your private plan rate is higher than 0.88, your employees cannot pay more than 0.44. So then you, the employer, are responsible for the balance of the cost. And keep in mind, it's 0.88%, whatever the case may be, it's capped at FICA wages. So moving on then here, under the public plan, for those of you that have fewer than 31 employees in the state of Minnesota, you could potentially qualify as a small employer. and have a discounted employer contribution. You have to be 30 or fewer employees in the state of Minnesota. The average wage of those employees in Minnesota has to be 150% or less than the state's average wage. That is approximately $111,000 a year. Okay, so if that applies to you, fewer than 31 employees, and the average wage is 150% or less of the state's average wage, then the employer contribution is half of what it would be. So your employer contribution is 0.22. In that scenario, your employees still pay 0.44. So this break is really on the employer side, not the employee side. Okay. On the private side, small employer contribution rules do not apply. Some carriers do kind of have like shelf pricing depending on the number of employees that an employer might have, but they don't have a kind of price break in the way that the public plan does. Private plans might have a multi-year rate guarantee. We know on the public side that 0.88 will pay that through 2026. We don't yet know what the rate will be for 2027 on the public side. We do know that the maximum it can be is 1.1%, but do we know 100% for sure that it's going to be 1.1% for 2027? We don't know that today. I do think we should anticipate that it will increase, but we don't know what it will be today. So think about too, like, what are the service expectations? This is the state of Minnesota is doing their paid leave. They're doing their own administration, right? So they are hiring employees to be in customer service. They're hiring employees to process claims, all of the things that go along with running a plan like this. I think for those of you that are either, you know, you're going to be in the public plan or you're considering being in the public plan, I think now is the time to brace yourselves for a rough go for a few months in the public plan. It's just, I want the public plan to be successful, but I think we would be prudent to anticipate some bumps, some delays, etc. On the private side, it's not going to be perfect, right? But you have what I call more avenues for assistance. You'll have claims customer service, you'll have an account manager at your insurance company, you'll have your broker, right? Your broker will have escalated service contacts to reach out to should things go pear-shaped on the private side. You will not have that on the public side. Both public and private, you have posting and notification requirements. And even on the private side, if you choose private insurance, you are still subject to wage reporting. The last thing I want to point out here on this slide, if you end up with private coverage, and then at some point, either by choice or not choice, you have to go from private back into the public plan. If your private plan approval is ever revoked voluntarily or involuntarily, you are obligated, I call it, to swim in the public pool for a period of 3 years. Okay. You could start off in public and go to private. I call it any time on the quarter, right? April, July, October, January 1st. You can move from public to private. But when you go from private to public, you're in the public pool for 3 years. I'm a little surprised that I still have to say this in September 2025. But friends, there is no opt-out, right? But Sarah, my employees are never going to use this. Okay. But Sarah, our plan is so much more generous. Do we really have to do this? Yes, you do. If you have employees in covered employment, you must participate in Minnesota paid leave. There is no opt-out. Some vendors call getting private plans kind of opting out, and I think that's confusing because all you're doing is you're opting for private coverage instead of the public plan. You're not actually opting out of the program itself, you're just opting for a different solution. All right, the other thing I want employers to think about when they're choosing that public versus private, you know, which way do I go? Cost is always important, right? Because as we talked about, your employees can't pay more than 0.44, in 2026. So if you're seeing a private plan rate that's higher than 0.88, you, the employer, are going to have to make up that difference. So cost is always important. But also, I want you to think about the things that we're talking about here on this slide. What do you want your employees' experience to be? How hands-on is your HR or your leave team in how hands-on are they in that process when an employee has to be away from work? I've talked to some employers who are like, I hate this, Sarah. I hate Minnesota paid leave. I want the state to handle it because I have chosen to provide life insurance and disability insurance that I pay for. So if I make this paid leave look like it's part of my benefits package, I don't want that. Okay, right? That's fine. I want you to think about some of these things that are outside of the price consideration. Do you have employees in multiple states? Right? So if your employees who are outside of Minnesota see, maybe they're not reading super closely and it's like, oh, I get paid for 20 weeks with, the same carrier that does my disability. Sounds like a great idea, right? Is that going to be confusing? Or do you have really strong benefits education where that's not going to be a problem? We want this to be easier. We want employees to be able to file disability, paid leave, maybe FMLA administration, all under a single roof. So think about what's your benefits philosophy? How easy, how simple is the process going to be? Do you want it to be simple? Do you want it to be more complicated? Right? Think about all of those considerations. This private plan process is a multi-step process. If you have not yet received a private plan quote and you think you're interested, I am telling you, friends, now is the time to do it. Do not wait, right? Because when you have private coverage, you actually have to apply to the state and be approved to have private coverage. So you've got to get your quote. Once you get your quote from your carrier, you have to tell your carrier, yes, we want you to do it. Unum, Principal, Met, Standard, Hartford, whoever the case may be. Yes, we want you to do it for us. The carrier is going to have to send you some, sold case paperwork because this is a new line of coverage, right? You as the employer are going to have to complete that. You're going to have to get that completed paperwork back to your carrier, and your carrier is going to issue you a policy number, a plan number, and policy documents. You need all three of those things plus your application fee before you can apply to the state to have private coverage. So all of those things need to happen before you can even apply. For those of you that operate with employers that have multiple sub-tax IDs, that application must be made per tax ID and your application fee must be paid per tax ID. Once you go through that process and the state says, congratulations, your private plan is approved, you want to take that approval letter, get it back to your carrier so then they can complete the process. So I say all of that because I want you to plan accordingly. DEED, the governing body of Minnesota paid leave, is telling employers, hey, if you want to do this, you should get your applications in by November 10th. Okay. I am telling you right now, do not wait that long. Absolutely do not wait that long. I'm telling anyone who will listen, aim for mid to late October, right? Aim for mid to late October. Also, I have seen a couple of carriers come out and say, hey, if you want us to do this for you, we got to know, literally one of them has said by September 15th, right? That is a week and a half away, I think. Another carrier said, we gotta know by the end of October, right? If you want us to do this. So work carefully with your broker partners. Make sure that you are allowing yourself enough time. And part of the reason why there's these deadlines popping up is because there's notification requirements, right? There's posting and notification requirements to come along with Minnesota paid leave. And in that notification requirement, you have to tell your employees, among other things, how much the plan costs, what their contribution will be, and how to file a claim. So you need to be able to direct your employees in that notice. Are they filing with the state or are they filing with a private insurance company? Okay. All right. 15 minutes. Do you want to take time for a couple of questions, Jenna?
Yes. So I think you just answered the one of them, which was around the requirement prior to January to notify employees of Minnesota paid family leave. And as you just shared, it sounds like that is, yes, that is a requirement.
That is posting requirements, right? So put a poster up in your workplace, wherever
Okay.
you're putting your OSHA and your FMLA. The model poster in English is available on the Indeed website. The notices, I haven't seen any model notices, but I know they are coming. You
Okay.
do need to post and notify in your employees' native languages. And super important here, as part of the notification requirement, employers need to collect an acknowledgement of receipt. That acknowledgement of receipt can be written or it can be electronic.
Okay. Great. Thank you. The next question, we have a couple on this topic, going back to the 26 weeks for former employees. Can you clarify what that means? And is that only for private plans?
Yeah, so under private plans, um, here we go, former employee coverage for up to 26 weeks. If we say, hey, I don't want to deal with the state because that sounds like no fun, I want my insurance company to do this for me, you can do that, right? Let's say I am your employee, and let's say that we part ways, really, for any reason. I, as your former employee, have up to 26 weeks following the end of employment to potentially file a paid leave claim under your private plan. Now, remember, in order for me to do that, I have to be eligible. I have to have enough wage credits to do that. Um, I cannot receive Minnesota paid leave and unemployment at the same time. Unemployment would trump Minnesota paid leave. It would overrule, and I would only receive unemployment. And I cannot have gained other employment. So if I leave you and go immediately to a different employer, I can't file that claim, right, under your private plan. But if for some reason I separate employment, I remain unemployed, I have up to 26 weeks to file a claim under the private plan. On the public side, for those of you that end up, over here on the public side, your employees could theoretically still file a claim, but the money is going to come from, the state's program, and really they just have to have enough wage credits.
Okay. Sarah, based on what you're seeing, what you're hearing, how many do you believe that employers are generally ending their previous paid leaves, parenting leave, for example, and only offering the Minnesota paid leave plan?
Generally, no.
Okay.
Generally, no. Because a lot of those, say, paid parental leave programs pay 100% of pay, right? Minnesota paid leave, we saw, caps out at 90%. And for some of your higher wage workers, they're going to get significantly less than 90% replacement under Minnesota paid leave. So, what I would suggest employers think about is specific to those types of, say, paid parental leave programs. Is it your intent to allow employees to do Minnesota paid leave and then your corporate paid leave, one right after the other? Or is it your intent to have them run at the same time? Whatever your intent is, make it clear in your corporate policy which way it's supposed to be. And if the intent is to have them run concurrently, make it clear in your policy that you want Minnesota paid leave to pay first, because if you don't, it's substitution, and that's a whole separate thing. So no, I would say I'm not seeing employers cancel that, especially for multi-state employers, right? If you cancel your paid parental leave program and you've got a contingency of employees outside of Minnesota, well, then you've just taken it away from everyone. That was a long answer to something that should have been just no.
Super helpful. Thank you. Another question here for disability and FMLA medical leaves, the provider certification is often a delay. Do we have any idea what the process for Minnesota paid leave provider certification will look like? For example, level of detail, burden, supporting records, etc.
Oh boy. Yeah. The short answer to that is not yet. Not yet. I can tell you what I have seen, say, in Colorado, right? Um, but I don't know if that's going to be the exact same process for Minnesota. I would expect the type of documentation needed to look pretty similarly to federal FMLA type of documentation, right? So if the barrier of entry to qualify for disability is here and the barrier of entry for level of detail for FMLA is down here, I would expect the Minnesota paid leave type of documentation to look a lot more similar to federal FMLA than to disability. Um, I can tell you that there will be documentation required, but to what level of detail, I haven't seen any sample forms yet. All right, employer preparation, just because I want to get through, you're going to get a copy of this, so I'm not going to read it all to you. I'm going to hit the highlights. Remember, by December 1st, plan for that posting and notification requirement and plan for how you're going to validate delivery, receipt of those notifications. Okay. Um, think about how you want to handle what changes do you need to make to your short-term disability plan. For those of you that have traditional group short-term disability, Minnesota paid leave is going to pay first. Short-term disability is going to pay second. And for many cases, short-term disability benefits may not pay at all, depending on the level of benefit there. I have a slide kind of at the end of this that talks about integration. So when you get a copy of this deck, you can review that there. How are you going to collect employee premiums while the employee is out on leave? One thing you need to do, regardless of public or private, is designate paid leave contacts at your company. You can have more than one. So that is on the public side, when I file a claim, who is at the employer is going to be notified that a claim has been filed. On the private side, you still need to designate that paid leave contact at your company in the UI/paid leave account, because that's the person who's probably going to be filing for your exemption and filing for the annual renewal. This hyperlink right here is highlighted because it's a relatively new addition to the Minnesota paid leave website. There's some great get ready steps. Most of them pertain to the public plan, but even for those of you that are planning on private coverage, check those steps out. There's some really good information for you as well. Last thing that I want to make sure I mention is for those of you that end up on the private side, private coverage, and you're working with your existing SCD, LTD Life, whatever the case may be, a vendor, expect your bill for paid leave to be separate. Expect it to be self-billed quarterly in arrears. Okay, so it's going to look very different from your traditional insurance bill. That came as a surprise to a lot of employers in Colorado and Oregon. So I want to make sure that all y'all aren't super surprised by that. I think we have about 2 minutes left. Jenna, are there a couple of things we want to address?
This is, again, Sarah, this is going back to the acknowledgement
Yeah.
of paid leave. Is there any forms that are more recommended than others? Like, does electronic method work? Are there any requirements around the acknowledgement that you're aware of?
Yeah, so what I'm aware of, thank you for saying that. What I'm aware of is that the statute says that the acknowledgement may be written or electronic.
Okay.
Stop.
Okay.
So I've talked to employers who are talking about, smaller employers might just do an Outlook read receipt, right?
Mhm.
So store your read receipts. I talked to an employer who said, oh, I'm pretty sure I can do that in our ADP system, right? So you don't have to turn that acknowledgement in anywhere. You just have to retain it so that in the event of an audit or whatever the case may be, you can show the state that you did provide that notice to employees. That's for by December 1st, and then ongoing for new hires or those who might be newly eligible for Minnesota paid leave.
Great. Thank you. Well, we are right at noon. I just have to give a shout out to Marie Pruitt, who says she's attended many Minnesota paid leave webinars recently, and this has been excellent. So, Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your expertise, answering these questions. We certainly appreciate it. And just thank you to all of those of you that joined and took the time. And we hope this information was valuable. A couple of thank yous, certainly to Sarah, to PK Korea at MMA, Jenny Korea at Versique for really coming up with this idea and making it possible, to Versique's marketing team for pulling this all together. So thank you, everyone. And with that, we will go ahead and wrap up. Sarah, unless you have any closing remarks.
Good luck out there, friends.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.